Welcome everybody to our panel today on open data for climate action. I'm joined by some great guests today from a variety of different organizations, all working to leverage open data for climate action. So I'll do a brisk round of introductions. So first we have Sonia Cooper from Microsoft, where she is the Assistant General Counsel, a lot of focus on open innovation. We also have Sneha Ramamurphy, who is from R² Factory at Rolls-Royce. We have Matt Webb, Head of Enterprise Data at UK Power Networks, and Mellissa Tallack, Open Data Lead at Northumbrian Water. So welcome everybody. So what sort of brings us all together here is obviously passion for data for climate action, but there's also a sort of formal partnership that we're all a part of called the Industry Data for Society Partnership. And that is a variety of different private sector organizations that are committed to making industry data more accessible so that nonprofits, researchers, other private enterprises, and governments can work together to better understand today's societal challenges and to take action. So I'll talk a little bit more about that as we sort of wrap up for the day, but I wanted to just sort of dive into the questions and hear from our speakers. So first question, it's a big one, so Sonia, I hope you're ready. What is the role and responsibility of the private sector in combating the climate crisis, and how can open data support that?
Big question. So I guess just a little context. I mean, we're at a time of huge opportunity to be able to solve problems with data. We've got compute power, we've got the sophisticated algorithms. With access to the data, we really can start to analyze and solve some of society's biggest challenges like climate change, and definitely the private sector has an enormous role to play. Microsoft launched an open data campaign back in 2020, where our aim was to help drive better access to data, better collaboration with data, and we partnered very closely with the ODI in that effort. Yeah. But since we're very keen also to partner with other companies to really highlight the role that the private sector does have in addressing some of these big societal issues, which is why we're very excited to be part of the Industry Data for Society partnership. And so just moving on to the question in relation to how open data can solve climate change, I think it's about looking at the applications of that data. So, for example, better access to open data means that organizations can actually consider their emissions across the entire supply chain, which you wouldn't otherwise be able to assess. You can consider your own carbon footprint and reducing it, because you'll have data that enables you to optimize your operations. And then also looking at open environmental data, like the data that Microsoft's made available on the planetary computer. Organizations can assess their climate risk, but they can also assess their impact on local environments. And so this is an opportunity really for me to plug the Open Data Challenge that the IDSP actually launched today. And so this is a data challenge that relates to helping local governments look at their local environments using open data and think about innovative ways really that local governments can improve the local environment in a way that helps them address their net zero goals. And so that's something that was launched today. So hopefully we'll be able to share more information on that.
Great. Thank you very much. And yes, excellent plug for the challenge, so please check that out. So Sneha, same question. Where do you see the role of open data from the private sector in climate action?
So I think it starts by being responsibly accounting the data that you have. A lot of things boils down to how you perceive open data, because interestingly, industries do use some level of open data, be it the research, be it the technology, be it the initial level of assessment that you want. Your first go-to place is your data sets are your open data sets, and then it boils down to the level of how you take that and understand your industry-specific private sector data sets. It's not just about the proprietorship that's tied up around it. I think it's more like you are driving the change by being accountable and being more transparent about how you manage the data. And you thereby contribute towards understanding the better climate policy making, because you may not give away your IP, but you are in a way kind of pursuing that, and you're trying to democratize the value of using open data. So private sectors, according to me, have a huge role to play. Be very open and vocal about what data sets you use and why you use that for, because in a way you're influencing the climate policy making, and that's crucial because that's how you understand the product.
Very, very quiet, so I'm going to give you this. So sorry to interrupt,
No,
but I
that's
really want
fine.
people to hear what you're saying. So,
All right, so that's how you can actually change things as a society, because as an industry you have a limitation, you have a boundary that you got to deal with. But when you think beyond, you're actually leveraging the open data that's available for everyone, but you are also making the, like taking a next level of building the trust in the open data, which is, according to me, a key aspect, because people need to trust the data that you have. And the value of that can exponentially increase when you, maybe as a data user, a consumer, or a provider, you have the liberty of how you use the open data. So the frameworks that we have across the industries don't often address this, because we have classifications and governance which strongly sits inside out. It's more like looking at the data that you have inside and how you manage it and deal with it. But you never talk about how do you actually get the data for different aspects, be it the society change. Understanding the climate crisis is not just in a closed loop. You need to know about your supply chains. You need to know about the entire value chain. And to understand different actors across, you need access to different data sets. And I think as an organizations, as industries across, we need to come together collaboratively to do something about it and think the way we can maybe shape the data, the future of the open data. That makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. I think the supply chain is a great use case for open data. Matt, you're in the energy sector, so this must be at the forefront of your mind. Where do you see the role of the private sector?
I think it comes down to the point that Sneha mentioned around responsibility. So as individual organisations, we have that direct responsibility to reduce our own carbon footprint and environmental impact. And the way that open data has a role to play is in the external sense. How can we help facilitate broader decarbonisation? And obviously within the energy sector, it's quite apparent how we have a role to play in that respect. So whether it's on generation, distribution network operation, system operation, we have a wealth of data that exists for quite specific purposes from a legacy standpoint. And by holding on to that data, by it being internalised, we're limiting its value. We're limiting the actionable insight that can be achieved. And as we'll all appreciate, given our backgrounds, true value from data, its full potential, is by unlocking it, making it available, integrating it with other data sets. And a key thing for me around open data is around the aspect of cognitive diversity. We, as a network operator, in the case of UK Power Networks, will look at data through a specific lens and for a specific purpose. Others will look at that and see something very, very different, and will have an idea about, if I combine that data with X or Y and just take a different approach, all of a sudden you have unrealised value. And when it comes to decarbonisation, there's huge potential there.
Absolutely. And Melissa, in the water sector, obviously at the forefront of this as well. Where do you see the role of data?
Well, I think it's when you, to echo some of the points that have already been made, when you consider that over 70% of the carbon footprint of a business is in its scope 3, you can't solve that alone. You can't solve that with your own data. You have to open up your data. You have to use other open data sources. Another water company has done their scope 3 accounting and found that 81% of the scope 3 emissions actually come from the use of the product. So that's the heating of water for things like cleaning, washing. And so we're already into a world where we're having to sort of combine the worlds of water and energy. And then you're into the world of, well, are we working with appliance manufacturers and cleaning product manufacturers? And how can we reduce both the energy footprint and the water footprint together? So you can't do it alone. I mean, it's just as simple as that. You just cannot do it with your own data. You have to open up and you have to use others' data.
That's a great segue into my next kind of question then, which is, where have you seen this sort of collaboration work already? So, what does the public sector have to play? We're here talking about collaboration between private and public. What role do they have to play, and how can they catalyze what's already being done by the private sector, or what needs to be done by the private sector?
So I think that you've got that sort of cycle of behaviour drives policy, drives behaviour, and we've seen some of that. And certainly in the utilities sector, we've seen the development of the National Underground Asset Register, which is designed to bring all of those different data sets together of buried assets, so that we can improve safety and reduce waste, which is obviously linked to carbon as well. But actually, that's kind of like from first idea in 2017 or 18 to just about realising now that sort of like policy drives behaviour drives policy. In the climate scenario, is that too slow? And probably yes, because I don't think we've got, well, if you listen to Gavin talk on net zero, we don't have that amount of time left. So we have to find some way of accelerating that.
Yes, Matt, same question. How does UK Power Networks work with the public sector on these huge issues?
So we engage very heavily with local authorities at all scales, and the key part of that is understanding their challenges, their demands, their needs, and what role our data and information can play in informing that. So local area energy planning is fundamental in terms of achieving targets and objectives around decarbonisation at every level of society. So the more that we can gain that insight, that understanding of what they want and need, and what have we got that they don't even recognise as having that potential, is really important. And we've spent quite a lot of time and effort just to get that base level of understanding in the first instance, to then build and iterate in terms of the services, the products, the packaging of what we provide with our open data, to make sure it's meeting those needs. And what's interesting in terms of the insights we've gained is there's huge variation in terms of the level of maturity and capability across local authorities. So therefore, being able to overcome some of the limitations that they may have internally in terms of understanding in the first instance, but accessing, using, consuming and putting that data to work has really changed the way that we've had to shape our approach, but also changed the way that we look at some of our own data assets ourselves. And it's by doing that we're helping inform policy, to help inform forward strategy and planning, justify investment, and really make sure that we're accelerating as quickly as possible.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, lots of people see the public sector as the real data provider, but in the case of local authorities, local governments, they're really critical data users as well. So having that data available is really key. Sneha, how do you see the role of the public sector in working with private sector on these kind of climate ambitions?
I think it's more like a two-way agreement that you need to build over a period of time, because most often we have access to very limited data sets, but a part of the challenge is because we don't have enough of data that's kind of discovered at the early stages, and you don't have in proper accounting that's coming for the open data sets that's there. Maybe the catalogs are so wide, and you kind of cannot take the trust of the actual data providers because it's coming from Kaggle or somewhere else. But when you drill down and you kind of introspect, right, you kind of need to have that valued element of how we scrutinize the open data so that the private sectors treat that as consumable assets. So that's my preview at the moment. But across, I think, Rolls-Royce and our Square Factory, we kind of look at engaging across the local authorities for different projects that we run. And that starts off by, taking a look at our net zero and scope 3 emissions to all the way up to where we need to meet our regulatory, objectives for the current year. And I think we invest heavy on trying to know more around the engineering space, but we also need to establish consensus around how we kind of calculate our footprint, which is also digitally, accounted for a lot of products and services, the digital apps and things that we develop, which we are not yet doing that at the moment.
Right, and Microsoft is a global company, so I'm sure there's a raft of experience there with working with the public sector. What role have you seen that play, and how have you seen that played out?
So I guess from my personal experience of working with the London Data Commission on identifying pilot projects that use data for the benefit of London, I think what was clear there actually, and to Matt's point in actually identifying for the public sector to explain what is needed, I think is really helpful, and that helps define the specific problem that you're trying to solve. And I think that is really quite essential when you're looking at data collaborations in particular, because that is really what helps drive that development of an ecosystem that you can then understand the value exchange in terms of why companies should be providing data to help with that particular problem.
Great. So I'm going to kind of flip it on its head a little bit. We're talking about what works and where have we seen these successes. But obviously, anyone that's worked with open data, either trying to publish it or use it or standardize, there's a lot of challenges as well. So I'll start with you, Sneha. What challenges have you faced working in the space of open data and collaboration for climate action? And how have you overcome them if you've been able to?
Oh, well, purely wearing the data engineering hat, I think it's the data that needs to be cleaned. It's like crazy amount of data, right? So I think, interestingly, the question itself is like you have enough of data sets out there, but you don't have the right level of quality of it. Is not something that's dictated by any body or medium. And you would never have the value of the data assessed until and unless you spend time cleaning it, and it goes through a lot of processing, and you kind of are trying to use it to address the right kind of a business problem or a challenge. So the value of the data is actually it's kind of underpinned with how you unlock the insights. And so until that moment, it's very hard to say that what's the challenge of the data and what data sets you kind of need, because in my opinion, the data sets, you kind of need everything. Mm-hmm. At some point it's useful, but you never know when you kind of are using it. So I think it's more like you're using it at the right place and the right time. That's when the value gets created. So yeah. Yeah,
so it's like taking those, making sure that at the foundation things are working,
yes,
so that they can be used for
yeah,
a variety of different. Matt, do you have similar views, different ones? How's your experience?
I'm going to disagree slightly, actually. So, yes, data quality is important, but it shouldn't be a limiting factor, because it's very rare that you get perfect data, and sometimes it's used as a point of defense or even an excuse to not openly share data. It's not good enough in that what-if scenario, and you've got liabilities, and all those aspects come into play. And I think you have to break through that to a certain extent and realise even imperfect data often has a value. But absolutely, it's there. I think the challenges are actually much, much broader than the data. From my experience, the cultural, behavioural aspects are a big part. From an industry where it's historically quite internalised and defensive to a certain point, but for good reason. We own and operate a critical national infrastructure. And we need to be very careful about the risks involved with exposing that. So when you're trying to make that shift in thinking and mentality around closed to open, that doesn't happen quickly. Mm-hmm. And you have to try and push the boundaries and be as bold as possible, but accept that you will face challenges, especially when it's a learning curve from a behavioural, cultural point of view, the legalities and licensing and the control mechanisms that are there, and how effective and proportionate are they? Do they give enough control, or do they give too much where it's no longer truly open and therefore usable? The technological aspects come in and so on. But I think for me, it's the human aspect is the most difficult.
Yeah, very, very true. We definitely see both of those as well in the work that we do. Mellissa, the water sector is kind of going through a bit of an open, I don't know if it's a renaissance or having its open moment right now, but are you seeing like similar issues that Matt has outlined in the energy sector, or how does that look? Yeah,
for a lot of the same reasons, critical national infrastructure. And if anybody was here for Sarah Womer's presentation about the weaponisation of data, that's a real risk. So it is a human thing. It's the fear versus opportunity sort of conundrum. It's like there's so much opportunity with it. There's also so much fear. Some of it founded, some of it unfounded. And I think that then brings us back to what underlies all this, which is the level of capability and understanding and education, literacy. How could we do this safely? Because we can do it, but how do we do it safely?
Mm-hmm. And what has Microsoft's journey been like with the launching the Open Data campaign, being an open data leader in the world in the private sector? So, what are those challenges like?
Yeah, I mean, totally agree with your points. I think it's definitely not a technical challenge, it's a mindset challenge. And I think if we are looking to really unlock the value of data and explore those opportunities, it's really about addressing that mindset challenge. And I think it's, particularly in the private sector, understanding how to drive that, learning really around how that collaborative effort can be applied to data in the same way as I guess there was this mindset shift around open source. I think the same applies to data.
Yeah, I mean, what we found as well is that having to make the business case internally really helps. Does any of you like to speak to, how to make that pitch that open data is not just good, but it's good for business? Is there any sort of anecdotes that anyone here on the group has?
I'm trying to think of a specific example, but I think the key thing is reputational in the first instance. Mm-hmm. When you look at the journey that energy's been on, and water, I think is starting to accelerate and catch up quickly. The response we've received from being proactive and taking that step and pushing that boundary, as I described before, has been really, really well received by the end customer. The value is not with us as an organisation at the end of the day by opening up data, it sits elsewhere. So the Greater London Authority was mentioned in the work that you've done with them, Sonia. They fed back recently that we've listened to their needs, we've responded, we've exceeded them by giving them the data that they need to inform their questions, to gain the answers, to act and do the right things in future for the benefit of the City of London and decarbonisation, that wider societal benefit. So it's absolutely there. Mm-hmm. It's just stopping looking at the value as a purely internal thing. It's that broader piece, and I think that's happening across all aspects of industry at the moment.
Great. And so maybe just on that sort of last point before we open it up for questions. So Sonia, if you were talking to business leaders, trying to tell them about Microsoft's experience, how would you maybe convince them or pitch it to them that open data is the right thing to do in this space around climate action?
So I think there's a clear societal need for businesses to actually take responsibility, and it's a board level issue now as well, in that businesses do need to respond responsibly and thoughtfully. So I think it's everyone needs to take urgent action. But I think in terms of the value of open data, it's around identifying a problem and then building the business case around that.
Great. Yeah. So not open data for open data's sake, but really honing in on what are the use cases, what's the value that's being created. We have some time left that we want to use for Q&A. Open it up to the group, and you're the first person I've seen. So. Oh, maybe we can provide that in GIF.
Hello, so I'm Ivy. I work at Viva City. We actually work with local councils to provide them with traffic data. We have sensors that can detect that. So just carrying on this conversation you're having, open data clearly here is very important because traffic, huge environmental concerns. But I can see some people at my company saying, oh, well, data is our IP. That's where our value is. So, maybe this is more for the private sector, but how would you, not necessarily argue, but how would you come at that? Do you agree? Do you disagree? What are your thoughts there?
Anyone want to start? Matt?
Yeah, sure. So it comes down to, Melissa just whispered, risk assessment, and it's balancing value and risk. So within energy, we've got the concept of triage. So you evaluate a data set discreetly to decide to what extent can I and should I openly publish it. Does there have to be some sort of control in place? Do we need to mitigate, redact, aggregate, obfuscate data in some way, shape or form to take away any risk? And commerciality is one of those considerations, intellectual property. good old GDPR, and it goes on and on. There's all these things you need to think about, and they'll be quite specific to each individual organisation and industry. And it's only by going through that risk assessment and understanding that balance of value versus risk that you decide. So within utilities, comparing electricity to water to telco, telco will be far more commercially focused because of the nature of that industry compared to what water and electricity are, and they'll be far more as a sector leaning towards what you've just described, as opposed to for us as regulated monopolies, that commerciality is there but not as strongly. So I think that's the only advice you can give, is to have an effective, proportionate process that allows you to make sure you're not getting it wrong one way or the other.
Great. So we go to
Yes, I'm doing some project on water. That's why maybe I would be interested to have your opinion. And the concept is, yes, is put in relation climate and water resource, or maybe water resource integrate to regional development. Now, it's correct to have this open, let's say, data available, as well as we do federation and we do accessibility. But what is missing in this type of cycle is, let's say, the people. In other words, it looks this top-down approach that you provide to the people, the technology, the tool, the, let's say, the data, etc., while in our approach that we try to develop is more a community data-driven approach where you teach and the community decide how to solve the problem of climate in water. But it's not even climate, because you're talking about hydrometeorology, not really climate. Climate is modeling the climate is quite hard concept. So the question is how then you can integrate it, both the global climate with the local climate, involving the people. And you need a technology. I mean, you need this concept of supply system that is quite hard also to build it. And then we're talking at global level. Thank you.
So I think you're absolutely spot on with the community, because it's not just about us publishing data. It's actually working with communities because I know it's really hard for a regulated company to say we don't have all the answers, because we're not used to saying that kind of thing. But actually, we don't have all the answers. We have lots of data, but there's lots of other people out there who have the answers potentially with our data. So, I think, again, if any of you attended the plenary with Damani Corbyn, he said, without open data, people can't get involved and collaborate. And to me, that's it. It's not for us to solve the problems using open data, it's to open our data so other people can solve the problems that we have. And so I totally support your, and I've personally be driving that with Northumbrian Water to create an ecosystem of people who can collaborate.
So what have you done as water climate in your, I think it's Northumbrian Water Council or County Council? Yeah.
It's Northumbrian Water, yeah. So we focus very much on. Sorry, you're going to cut me off, aren't you? We can talk after.
Yeah, but just wanted to wrap it up. But first off, to thank you all for being here today and talking about this really important topic. Really appreciate your time. And then finally, also want to plug the challenge as well. So the Industry Data for Society Partnership Challenge, the Data for Local Environment, the Data for Local Environments Challenge. There's if you're a data user, if you're working in the climate data space, there's going to be a large innovation challenge that's being led by the organizations here today. Up to $100,000 will be available to the winners of the challenge. So it's a real thing that we want everyone to get involved with. So take a look if this is your space. And thank you all for being here today.
Thank you.